In the summer of 1945, London stood at the center of a global victory. Nazi Germany had been defeated. The British flag still flew over an empire that spanned continents. Winston Churchill, the man who had refused to surrender when Europe fell, was internationally revered. By every traditional measure of power, prestige, military credibility, moral authority, Britain had won. And yet, this was the moment the British Empire effectively ended. Not in defeat, not in humiliation, but in victory. The collapse of British imperial power did not begin in the chaos of retreat or rebellion. It began quietly, bureaucratically, and almost invisibly, inside the very structures that had allowed Britain to survive the war at all. The decisions that saved Britain between 1940 and 1945 also stripped it of the ability to remain an empire afterward. This is not a story about incompetence, betrayal, or moral failure. It is a story about structural exhaustion, about a state that mobilized itself so completely to win a total war that it could no longer sustain a global empire once peace arrived. By 1945, Britain had done the impossible, and in doing so, it had made empire impossible to keep. In September 1939, Britain did not face defeat. It faced something more dangerous, the possibility that survival would require dismantling the system that made Britain powerful in the first place. From London, the British government still commanded the largest empire on Earth. On paper, this was a global advantage. In reality, the empire was not designed for a war that consumed everything at once. It was built for gradual pressure, controlled violence, and financial dominance, not for national survival against an industrial continental power. By 1940, after the fall of France, Britain's problem was no longer strategy. It was time. The war had to be fought immediately, and it had to be fought from London. That meant transforming the British state into something it had never been, a centrally planned, financially exhausted, emergency regime. Civilian markets were suppressed, imports were prioritized over exports, overseas assets were liquidated without regard for long-term consequences. Britain was no longer behaving like an imperial center. It was behaving like a besieged island. To stay in the war, Britain concentrated power inward. The Treasury took control of spending on a scale unprecedented in peacetime. The Bank of England stopped defending sterling as a global currency and began treating it as a rationed resource. Gold reserves and foreign investments, once the quiet foundation of imperial authority, were converted into weapons, food, and fuel. These decisions worked. By 1941, Britain was still standing. London still issued orders across continents. The empire still existed in form. But something fundamental had changed. Britain could now command the empire, but it could no longer finance it. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Because once Britain crossed the line from imperial creditor to imperial borrower, survival became possible, but empire became conditional. And the next step would make that condition permanent. By 1941, Britain had survived the moment when collapse seemed inevitable, but survival came with a price that was not yet visible and could not be reversed. The turning point was not a battle. It was a financial decision. When Britain entered the Lend-Lease Agreement with the United States, it secured the material means to continue fighting. American food, fuel, ships, and weapons flowed across the Atlantic. The war could now be sustained, but the terms of survival quietly dismantled the foundation of British imperial power. For generations, the British Empire had functioned because London sat at the center of global finance. Sterling was trusted. British capital flowed outward. Colonies and trading partners were bound to Britain not just by force, but by credit. Lend-Lease inverted that system. Britain no longer dictated the terms of global trade. It accepted them. Wartime necessity forced Britain to open imperial markets, suspend preferential trade, and subordinate sterling to the dollar-based system emerging under American leadership. These were presented as temporary wartime adjustments. They were not. At the same time, Britain extracted more from its empire than ever before. Colonial production was intensified. Indian industry was pushed to supply British needs. Sterling balances accumulated across the empire, money Britain owed but could not repay. The empire was financing Britain's survival, even as Britain lost the capacity to sustain the empire afterward. By 1944, the contradiction was complete. Britain was winning the war militarily, but economically it was being reorganized into a junior position within a new global order. Victory was now assured, so was dependency. And once the war ended, Britain would discover that it had won the conflict, but signed away control over the peace. In 1945, Britain did not lose its empire on a battlefield. It lost it at the negotiating table before most people realized negotiations were even happening. London emerged from the war victorious, but the international system that had once revolved around it no longer existed. The war had destroyed the old rules of power, and Britain had agreed to their replacement long before the fighting stopped. The empire had always depended on control of trade routes, currencies, and access to markets. But the post-war world was being rebuilt around a different principle: open access, enforced not by Britain, but by the United States. At Bretton Woods, Britain accepted a new financial order anchored to the dollar. Sterling survived, but only under American supervision. Imperial preference, the economic glue of empire, was now viewed as an obstacle to recovery. Britain's ability to use its empire as a closed economic system was no longer tolerated by its most powerful ally. This was not imposed through force. It was imposed through necessity. Britain needed American loans to import food and rebuild industry. Those loans came with conditions that quietly dismantled Britain's freedom of action. London could either defend imperial autonomy or stabilize its own economy. It could not do both. At the same time, Britain's colonies no longer occupied the same psychological space they had before the war. Wartime mobilization had politicized millions. Soldiers returned home trained, armed, and aware that Britain itself had depended on them. The language of sacrifice and freedom, used to justify total war, could not be contained once peace arrived. London now faced a transformed equation. Maintaining empire required money Britain did not have, force Britain could not justify, and legitimacy Britain could no longer assume. Victory had preserved Britain's state, but it had exposed the empire as a system the post-war world would not support. And the most dangerous consequence was still ahead. Because the moment Britain accepted that the empire could no longer be economically controlled, it faced a single question that would decide everything. Which part of the empire mattered enough to fight for? By late 1945, Britain was no longer deciding whether the empire would survive. It was deciding where it would end first. The immediate post-war crisis was not ideological. It was administrative. British forces were stretched across Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Shipping was scarce. Foreign currency reserves were exhausted. Every imperial commitment competed directly with food imports and domestic reconstruction. The illusion of imperial continuity collapsed under arithmetic. Nowhere was this clearer than India. India was not just Britain's largest colony, it was the keystone that made the rest of the empire coherent. It supplied manpower, revenue, and strategic depth. If India could not be held, the logic of empire collapsed everywhere else. By 1946, London faced two options in Delhi: either reassert control through mass military force or negotiate a transfer of power. The first required hundreds of thousands of troops, long-term occupation, and domestic political support Britain no longer had. The second meant abandoning the empire's core. There was no hidden alternative. At the same time, Britain was rebuilding itself into a different kind of state. The creation of the National Health Service, expanded welfare and industrial planning, tied political legitimacy to domestic delivery, not imperial prestige. Empire had become a drain on the very social contract the British government now depended on. In August 1947, Britain left India. This was not the end of the British Empire, but it was the moment its fate became irreversible. Once India went, the cost-benefit logic of empire collapsed everywhere else. Control without surplus was impossible. Britain had made its choice, and the rest of the empire now faced a question that could no longer be avoided. If Britain would not fight to keep India, where, if anywhere, would it fight at all? Once India left in 1947, the British Empire entered a new phase. Not collapse, but exposure. The illusion that empire was a self-sustaining system disappeared. What remained were individual territories, each requiring defense, administration, and political justification, without the economic surplus that had once made imperial rule viable. For the first time, London had to evaluate empire piece by piece. Some territories mattered strategically, others mattered symbolically. Few paid for themselves. Britain attempted to manage this reality through containment rather than control. Limited military interventions replaced long-term governance. Political concessions replaced extraction. Empire was no longer something Britain expanded or even maintained. It was something Britain tried to manage down. This approach failed the moment Britain encountered resistance that could not be resolved cheaply. In Palestine, Britain withdrew under pressure it could not absorb. In Malaya, it fought a prolonged counterinsurgency that drained resources and political attention. In Kenya, repression preserved control temporarily, but at a cost that eroded Britain's international standing. Each crisis forced London to confront the same calculation. Was this territory worth the cost of keeping it? The answer was increasingly no. The final illusion shattered in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. Britain, alongside France, attempted to assert imperial authority through force. Militarily, the operation was viable. Politically and economically, it was not. American opposition was decisive. When the United States threatened financial pressure, Britain backed down. The message was unmistakable. Britain could no longer act independently on the world stage. Imperial action without American approval was impossible. Suez did not end the British Empire. It revealed that it was already over. Britain had won World War II, but the victory had reordered global power so completely that empire had become unsustainable. And once that reality was undeniable, the final stage of British imperial withdrawal was no longer a question of choice. It was a matter of time. After Suez in 1956, there was no dramatic collapse, no single declaration announcing the end of the British Empire. What followed was something far more revealing: administrative withdrawal. Britain no longer argued about whether empire could be preserved. It argued about how quickly it could be dismantled without destabilizing Britain itself. From London, decolonization became a managed process. Power was transferred through negotiations, constitutional conferences, and staged independence ceremonies. This was not generosity, it was risk control. Britain's objective was no longer dominance, it was exit without catastrophe. Between the late 1950s and the early 1970s, Britain shed most of its remaining empire. Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia. Each withdrawal followed the same logic. Where transition could be negotiated, Britain left. Where violence threatened, Britain accelerated departure. Imperial rule had become a source of instability rather than security. The empire that once projected order now generated crises Britain could not afford. What replaced it was something smaller, quieter, and more sustainable. Alliances, financial networks, and diplomatic influence, tools suited to a world Britain no longer controlled. London remained important, but it was no longer imperial. It was national. By the time the British public fully absorbed what had happened, the empire was already gone. And that is the final irony. Britain did not lose its empire because it was defeated in World War II. It lost it because it won, and the cost of winning rewrote the rules of global power. Victory preserved Britain. Peace exposed the empire. The British Empire ended not with collapse, but with calculation. And by the time that calculation became obvious, there was no empire left to save. Britain's empire did not end the way empires are supposed to end. There was no final invasion of London, no imperial capital burned, no moment when the British flag was torn down in defeat. Instead, the empire dissolved after its greatest victory, because that victory demanded a level of mobilization, dependency, and transformation that empire itself could not survive. By 1945, Britain had proven it could still fight, still endure, still command respect. But it had also proven something more important, that survival in the modern world required a kind of state Britain had never been before. A welfare state, a managed economy, a nationally focused political system accountable to domestic voters rather than imperial prestige. Empire was incompatible with that reality. The British Empire had been built on surplus, financial, military, and administrative. World War II consumed all three. What remained after victory was a state strong enough to rebuild itself, but not strong enough to rule others indefinitely. This is why Britain's story after 1945 feels paradoxical. It did not decline because it failed. It declined because it adapted successfully to a new world. Victory forced Britain to choose what kind of power it would be. It chose to survive as a nation rather than persist as an empire. And that choice reshaped the modern world, because Britain was not the last empire to face this dilemma. It was simply the first to discover that winning a total war can cost more than losing one. The question Britain answered in 1945 still hangs over every great power today. What happens when survival requires becoming something you no longer recognize? Britain's empire did not fall because it was defeated. It ended because victory demanded a transformation the empire could not survive. And that leaves an uncomfortable question. If Britain had lost World War II, the empire would have ended in catastrophe. But because Britain won, it ended quietly, through spreadsheets, treaties, and choices that felt rational at the time. So here's the question worth arguing about. If you were in London in 1945, facing bankruptcy, global pressure, and domestic rebuilding, would you have tried to hold the empire anyway? Or was letting it go the only move left? There isn't a clean answer. That's why historians still debate it. Drop your view in the comments. Not what should have happened, but what you think had to happen. And if you think another empire is facing the same dilemma today, say which one and why. That's where the real history conversation begins.